Yes, yesterday, Sayadaw discussed 3 names that we have for physicality and mentality. That is anicca, dukkha, and anatta. There are 3 names that we have for one thing. Anicca refers to nama rupa, mentality and physicality, as does dukkha, as does anatta. These 3 names refer to the very same thing. And similarly, there are 3 aspects of this nama and rupa: that it is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and without an inherent self. So these are aspects of true phenomenon. These are 3 aspects, or 3 manners, or 3 marks of Dhamma. But so it is. Sayadaw gave an example of a cow. Now, if there's a cow, and it may have patches on it, okay, but that distinguish it. Okay. What it is a cow, and the patches are something that distinguishes it. They're its characteristic, that it has these patches. So, in the same way that the cow itself is different from these patches that appear on its skin, on its hide, the same way the aspects of nama and rupa, the aspect of being impermanent, being unsatisfactory, and being without an inherent self, are not the same thing as physicality and mentality itself. So just as the cow and its characteristics are 2 different things, the characteristics appear on the cow. But the cow itself is not the characteristic of the patches, and the characteristic of the patches is also not the cow. So physicality and mentality, rupa and nama, they have these 3 aspects. They arise and then pass away. Due to this, they're not good, and this happens without any self directing it. They're without self. Knowing nama rupa and knowing these 3 characteristics are 2 different things. However, the characteristics are an aspect of nama and rupa, so they're related in that way. But one has to understand that these are 2 different entities. Rupa and nama are a different thing from the characteristics of it. As we observe the ever-new arising object within our being, sometimes we know physicality, and sometimes we know mentality. Sometimes we see both occurring at the same time. When we see what is really there, well, if we don't see this, if we don't see what is really there, then we'll have the view, we'll think that this is I, me, that's him, her, it's a man, it's a woman, and so on. We'll think like this. But when we see what's really there, we dispel this view that there is a self when we discern nama and rupa. However, at this point, when we observe the object, we don't yet see the start or the end of it. These are not yet visible, although we're observing the object. These haven't become visible to us yet, and so at this stage we have not yet begun Vipassana knowledge. If we continue to note, we come to see the way mentality and physicality are related by cause and effect. A cause gives rise to a related result. Things are arising due to causes, and this becomes clear to us, so our doubt is cleared. If we don't know that what we experience is related to by cause and effect, then we think that what we experience is due to a creator, that a creator is making this happen. But when we see that due to causes, effects arise, and not otherwise, a cause gives rise to relevant effects, not otherwise, then we dispel the view of a creator. So we become free of doubt about this issue. And as we continue to know, we now see the start as well as the middle of the object. And especially in the body, it seems like one thing arises and then before it's finished another one arises. The objects appear like this in one mind. So an itch arises and we know itchy, or a vision arises, we know it's seeing. But before it comes to an end, another one arises, so we note that one. And then before that comes to a finish, another one arises, and we note that one. So at this point, we're just seeing the beginning and the middle of an object. We know cause and effect at this point, clearly, but we have not yet arrived at Vipassana knowledge. However, this is the basis without which Vipassana knowledge cannot arise. When we continue to note, we observe that things have a beginning and an end, and the old is always being replaced by the new. So we see now, as well as the beginning and the middle, we see the end of the objects. And because of seeing the end of the object we're observing, we know this knowledge arises in our mind, this is not permanent. So only when we see the end of the object that we are observing will we be starting to develop Vipassana knowledge. So continuing to note in this way, we are developing anicca-nupassana jnana, the knowledge of the characteristic of impermanence. And therefore, the view that things are permanent is being dispelled. Before we see the end of the object, before this stage in the practice, we don't see the end of the object, and therefore we think that things are permanent. The Buddha said, anicca nupassana bhavinto, necha senya pajahati. The one who develops insight into impermanence dispels the perception of permanence. But when we observe the arising object, we see clearly that it arises and then passes away. The old object is giving rise to new ones again and again. So we know that at this point that things are not permanent. And when we see this, when we see that things are not permanent, we also start to let go of mana, pride. Mana is the quality of thinking, I'm someone great, I'm alive, I'm a monk, whatever one is, it's taking pride in this. It's conceit based on a quality that one has. So when we see impermanence, this conceit about who I am is weakened. If we don't observe so that we know nama and rupa, so that we know cause and effect, and so that we see that the old always gives rise to the new, then we'll have the perception of permanence in this way. We'll think, I had a headache all morning. I was like this all morning. I was like this all day. I was like this all week. The mind and body that's existing right now, it will still be here tomorrow. We'll think, however we are, we'll think of it in terms of permanence. We will perceive it as permanent. And when we perceive ourselves as permanent, the conceit of I, asamimana, arises. So now, what we're doing is noting to see the objects, the arising object as it arises and passes away, and old giving way to the new. We know when we see the disappearance, we know it's impermanent, and one dispels the conceit of I at this point. So mana is one of the Dhammas which is expansionist. It always expands its territory. And as long as we have the view of permanence, we'll have pride. We'll have this type of conceit that I am this or I am that. But when we see impermanence, we will automatically dispel this form of pride which is conceit about I. And this is a benefit that we get automatically from the practice. When we see anicca, dukkha appears, and anatta is seen and known. When we see anicca, when we see impermanent dhammas, and when we see impermanence, then dukkha becomes apparent. When we see that the old are giving rise to the new always, and objects, as soon as they appear, they're disappearing, as soon as they're born, they're dying immediately. Therefore, we see that they're not pleasant. What we experience is dying every single second. And seeing this, one doesn't think highly of what one experiences anymore. One doesn't take pleasure in it. One stops thinking highly of it, and therefore one doesn't take pleasure in it. The object, both regarding the object and the noting mind, the yogi just becomes weary of it. The object is no good, and the noting mind is also no good. One feels like that as one continues to note. And this is because we're at the point where, because we see anicca, dukkha is apparent, the oppressive nature of phenomena is apparent. When we think that something is good, then we'll take pleasure in it. And because of that, tanha or craving will arise. So when we realize that it's not good, when we see the unsatisfactory aspect of phenomenon, then we realize it's not good. And then tanha, this craving, cannot arise. Tanha is another one of the expansionist dhammas. When we want something, we always want more. We want more. We get it and we want more immediately. So tanha tends to increase its territory. When the oppressive nature of phenomenon becomes apparent, then we know that it's not pleasant. Sukha. When dukkha appears, sukha is obviously not there. So only if we think that something is pleasant will tanha arise. So when we clearly see the unsatisfactory characteristic, then tanha can't expand any further. seeing the objects that arise and pass away, because they arise and pass away, they are oppressive. Seeing the oppressive nature of the object of observation and knowing that it is not good is dukkhanupassana jnana. And this dispels the tanha. So as we continue to note, when we observe the characteristic of anicca, it's said that the characteristic of impermanence is also seen. Anicca lakhanehi dete. Anicca lakhanehi dete. Anatta lakhanang detameva hoti. So when one is noting every arising object, knowing its impermanence, and seeing that it's not good, one also comes to see that there is no self. When Vipassana knowledge is mature, the noting goes of its own accord. It's like it's automatic. And it's very easy to keep on noting. And it's similar to driving a car with cruise control. The noting is just going on by itself. And at that point, we no longer see the start of an object. And we also no longer see the middle of it. So we only see the end. There's no more sense of a river flowing. We just see one object after another disappearing, as well as the noting mind. The noting mind is also disappearing, one after another. So, for example, heat arises, and immediately the noting mind, the mind which knows it, also arises, and they both disappear. So there's nothing satisfactory to be found in this. You just see dissolution. So what one sees is just the ending of the object. And it's said that at this point, the insight into impermanence has reached its peak. And it's also a double insight because of dukkha. It's also considered a double insight because one is aware of the unsatisfactory nature, that there's nothing satisfying in seeing how the object and the mind both end repeatedly. But it's part of anicca nupassana jnana. It's seeing the impermanence at the highest possible level. At this point, the practice is just going on of its own momentum. And at this point in the practice, what one previously perceived up to this point is a very subtle sense of self, a very subtle sense of permanence, and a very subtle sense of sukha. And these, up until this point, that type of very subtle perception is still there. But because we see the impermanence so clearly at the point at which the knowledge of impermanence has reached its peak, we see absolutely that there is no self in the object, and that there is no self in the noting mind either. This is just process, just a selfless process going of its own accord. So at this point, there's no longer any subtle wrong view. And this is a benefit that we get from the practice. This knowledge that we gain is one's own knowledge. It's our own knowledge. We know the Dhamma. We know Rupa and Nama, which are anicca, which are dukkha, which are anatta. we know their characteristics, the characteristic of Rupa and Nama, that it is impermanent, not good, and of a selfless nature. With every noting, we know both Rupa and Nama and its characteristic. This is not due to thinking, nor due to reading about it. It's knowledge that we possess ourselves. We see Rupa and Nama, which is true phenomena. And we see its characteristics, which are also true characteristics. So when we see what is true, everything becomes clear to us. And sometimes what we see is impermanent Dhamma and the characteristic of impermanence. Sometimes what we see is unsatisfactory Dhamma and the characteristic of unsatisfactoriness, dukkha lakkhana. Sometimes we see anatta Dhamma, the Dhamma which is selfless, and this selfless characteristic. So at the present time, at this period of time, for the most part, yogis tend to see impermanent Dhamma and the characteristic of impermanence. But when one sees one, the others are automatically known. And it's said, Tisu lakhanesu ekasame dete itaradvayang detamewa. Among the three characteristics, when one is seen, the other two are automatically seen. So when we see, for example, when we see the impermanent nature of phenomenon, itaradvayang, the other two, dukkha, the oppressive nature of phenomenon, the selfless nature of phenomenon, are also automatically known. When we see that things are not good, when we see the unsatisfactory nature of phenomena, dukkha lakkhana, then the other two, anicca lakkhana and anatta lakkhana, are automatically seen. And sometimes we see the selfless nature, that it's just process happening. At that time we see anicca lakkhana, and the other two, at that time we see anatta lakkhana, and at that time the other two, anicca lakkhana and dukkha lakkhana, are automatically known. And Sayadaw mentioned that seeing one true aspect, all are seen and known. Or seeing one of three, all are seen and known. When of these three true characteristics of phenomenon, when one is seen, all of them are seen. So when we talk about discerning Rupa and Nama, Rupa physicality and Nama mentality, Rupa is that which doesn't know, and it's called Rupa because it falls apart, it changes. So it's that which doesn't know. And Nama is that which knows, and it's called Nama because it knows. So this is mentality. And there are these two. These are called sabhava. That means that they are true nature and that they have their own nature. So Rupa, physicality, is impermanent, anicca. It's also dukkha and it's also anatta. So this anicca is Rupa, as well as dukkha, as well as anatta. They all refer to Rupa. And Nama also, mentality also, is anicca. And this same mentality is also dukkha. This same mentality is also anatta. So they have these three names, but these three names refer to the same thing. And as Sayadaw mentioned previously, it's like a person who has three names. So the person may have three names, and they use one name in one place, and one name in another place, and a third name in another place. So we meet the person in one place and we know that one name. But by knowing that person by the one name, we know the names that he or she uses in the other places. So we know the three names of the person by knowing one, and they refer to the same person. For those who at no time in their life have come to know the Satipatthana practice, and because they don't know it, they don't walk the path. Those people think that what is actually impermanent is permanent, and therefore mana is very prevalent. Mana expands its territory. And when we think that rupa and nama, physicality and mentality, are good, we think that seeing is good, hearing is good, tasting, touching, smelling, thinking, everything we experience is good, then tanha, craving, arises. Because we're observing the object of arising, with the practice of Satipatthana, and knowing its unsatisfactory nature, we know that the objects we observe are not good. We know that, then tanha, craving, is dispelled. If we don't observe the object with Satipatthana practice, then we think that things are permanent, and because of that we think there's a self. We don't know that what our experience is just true nature, just nature, and because of that, we think we have wrong thought, mecha vitaka. We aim for the wrong things. So, in this way, we suffer. We suffer from the expansionist dhammas of tanha, mana, and deti, if we don't practice. But due to the practice, now we are weakening these qualities with our practice, and we are reducing, no matter how much a hold they may have had on us previously, we are reducing their territory, and we will eventually get the better of them and eliminate them. So except for the time that we're asleep, Sayadaw urges the yogis that during the remaining time, during all their waking time, to observe with effort and aiming every time phenomena arises, every time there's the striker striking the base element and consciousness, contact and feeling arising. With every occurrence of an object at the sense doors, make effort and aim to know the true phenomenon, and make special effort to make sure to be mindful during all your general activities. That's all for tonight.